morning. This morning I'd like to start to tell you something about corrosion and the prevention of corrosion. This is one of the most insidious problems that we have in our society today insofar as materials are concerned, metallic materials. It depends upon who you talk to, but I have recently heard people that work in the field of corrosion say that in this country we lose $60 billion a year to corrosion. That means in the form of buildings and structures and devices that we have, we lose that much material. We have to replace about $60 billion worth of metallic materials per year. So it's a very serious problem. But I'd like to start this morning in a rather different way. I'd like to tell you about a book which, if you've never read, you'll find it a most amusing story, a true story. Actually, I think they've made a TV show about it. It's called A Great Train Robbery. I don't think it became too popular because the major theme in it is that crime does pay. But it's a story about the mid-century, 19th century England, a man who wanted to rob a train. And in mid-19th century England, if you wanted to lock something up to keep it safe, you had to have a key, a lock and key. And if you wanted to rob someone, you had to either get a key or make a key. And so in this particular story, by Sir Perdue, or the lost wax method, a man was able to copy the keys and rob a train. Well, toward the end of the 19th century, there was a man named Hadfield who probably invented the first stainless steel. As I've said before, I think that the first steel that man ever saw was stainless steel, because the metallic meteorites that fall out of the heavens are generally iron-nickel alloys, and they are stainless. And therefore they existed for long periods of time, and we find them in nature as almost like a native metal or a native alloy. But toward the end of the 19th century, a gentleman by the name of Hadfield in England came up with a new alloy, a new iron alloy. And I want to tell you about this particular alloy because it was a stainless steel. He didn't make this alloy to make a stainless steel. He made it for a different reason. And you recall in the iron-carbon equilibrium diagram, we had a maximum solubility of carbon in iron at about 2%, and we call those things steel. That says that the austenitic field was limited to 2% carbon. If instead of putting carbon with the iron, if we put another element like manganese, we find that instead of limiting the solubility of face-centered cubic iron for the manganese, we have an extended solubility, and it goes all the way up to 100% manganese. That is, we can get austenite to exist all the way across the diagram in various percentages of manganese as we move across. We do have an alpha field. It is subdued, it's crowded over into the corner. But if we have something like 13% manganese in the steel, we find that if we heat it up into the austenitic range and just cool it down at normal temperature, normal quench rates, we'll wind up with austenite at room temperature. If we have a little carbon in the steel, we find that we have a very unusual material. It's still made today, and it's called Hadfield steel. It happens to be a trip alloy. You may recall that when I was showing you something about allotropic transformation, I had a piece of material called nitinol, and we bent it, and after we bent it, we said, now we didn't really cause the material to strain harden. What we really did was to cause an allotropic transformation. And we heated it up and it straightened back out. Well, Hadfield steel, which had about 13% manganese and some carbon in it, a small amount of carbon, had this particular capability. That is to say, it would exist as austenite. But if you put a plastic strain in the material, if you plastically deformed it, it would transform to martensite and become very, very hard. And so all of a sudden in England, they had the capability of making a safe out of this material, which with the new locks, which were combination locks, prevented thefts. And if you made a safe out of Hatfield steel, and if you knew something about robbing a safe, and you knew if you drilled a little hole next to the tumblers, you could get in there and open the safe, and you had a drill, and you started to drill a Hatfield steel, the first little chip would roll out beautifully. But in that process, you would plastically deform the material under the chip, and it would turn to martensite. It would be as strong as the drill bit itself, and so that's all she wrote. You wouldn't go any further. Or if you tried a chisel, and you put it on the surface, and you hit one big blow with the chisel, and you'd find out you'd make a nice little dent, and then you'd start breaking the chisel up because you would be beating on martensite. Sounds like a great material, right? It is my understanding, although I've really never documented this, but it certainly is understandable that, you know, at the end of the 19th century in this country, we had great problems with, well, in the mid-19th century, we had great problems with the Mississippi River and earthquakes. We had a lot of earthquakes on the East Coast in the mid or early part of the 19th century, enough to change the course of the Mississippi River at points, and we made lakes over there that we didn't have before. And the Army got busy and started building levees all up and down the Mississippi to control where the water was going to go. So there was a tremendous effort to build these particular levees. And I understand that they had a problem with their clamshell buckets. The points on the clamshell buckets would wear out. They'd be digging up big rocks to make the dams out of, and the points on these clamshell diggers would wear out or break, or they just weren't too serviceable. And Hatfield Steel came along and they said, this is great, because now we'll go along with the clamshell bucket, and when we beat into the rocks, then that impact is going to change it to martensitic material, and they'll last a long time. And that worked fine, except down in the delta of the Mississippi, where they were also dredging silt with these things, and now they were having an abrasive material that was running by the surface of the little fingers, and it would abrade them or wear them away. There was no plastic deformation, no impact to change it to martensite, and so it didn't last so long. So you really have to kind of understand what's going on in this whole field of metallurgy, or you get fooled. You don't always have things that are serviceable as you think they should be. Well, it turns out that if we have such a stainless steel, we call it an austenitic stainless steel, and it is possible to have other kinds of stainless steels, and we have to find out what it is meant when we say it is stainless. And it turns out that if we put about 13% of several different kinds of elements in steel, that the material changes from a very active material to a very passive material. An active material means that it would corrode very rapidly, and a passive material means it wouldn't corrode probably hardly at all. And what you really need to know is, why do we have this transfer of active to passive? What's going on in the corrosion field that gives us this capability? Well, for a moment I'd like to stop talking about stainless steels and talk about aluminum. If you have a piece of aluminum, it is a passive material normally. Say pure aluminum, if you take a knife and cut a piece of aluminum, you make a fresh surface of pure aluminum, and in just microseconds, in very small interval of time, in a normal atmosphere, there will be an oxide film developed on the aluminum. That particular oxide film is impervious to air. That is, no more oxygen can get to the aluminum. And so the material is said to be passivated. It has a passive film on the surface. And so, if we put manganese in the steel at 13% or thereabouts, the material which prior to that would not build a film on the surface that was passive, a film that would prevent oxygen from passing into the metal itself to continue oxidation. At 13%, we're going to have enough oxidized manganese at the surface to prevent oxygen from going and reaching the steel. That is to say, we develop a kind of oxide that's impervious to the penetration of the air. And when that happens, we say we have a passive film. Or when we get any surface film that prevents further corrosion or further activity, we're going to say we have passivated the surface.
Hatfield invented stainless steel in the mid-19th century. Instead of simply adding carbon to iron, he added manganese. This extended the austenitic range of the steel. Stainless steel with 13% manganese and a small amount of carbon, also called Hatfield steel, will change from austenite to martensite under plastic deformation. This is known as an austenitic stainless steel. Adding alloying elements to stainless steel changes it from an actively corrosive material to one that is passive, does not corrode. Aluminum is passive because pure aluminum surfaces form an oxide film that prevents further reaction. Any material is said to be passivated after this type of surface film formation.
We find that if we had a austenitic steel like Hatfield steel, it may not be too serviceable because we may like a material that's, say, very, very nice and ductile, that's austenitic. We'd like for it to stay austenitic. And we find that all we really have to do is to leave the carbon out of the material, and now instead of being transformed by plastic deformation to martensite, the carbon is the material that prevented it, you see, from staying in the face-centered cubic structure or going to the body-centered cubic structure, kept the lattice expanded to make the tetrahedral structure that's martensite. And if you leave the carbon out, then you get a ductile material at room temperature, even if you plastically deform the material, and it'll stay austenitic. And so it was a pretty easy route then to see that we could have a steel that we could lower in temperature, actually transform to ferrite, and we could have ferritic stainless steels. But if we had enough of the material in it to cause it to build a passivated film, then we would have a stainless ferritic steel. So we can have martensitic stainless steels, we can have ferritic stainless steels, and we can have austenitic stainless steels. And there are three different types of stainless steels. And they have special designations, and we talk about 300 series as the austenitic stainless steels and 400 series as being the steels that will be ferritic or martensitic. Well, I would like to say something about the definition of corrosion. Corrosion, if you don't concern yourself just with metals and look at the broad area of corrosion, we say that corrosion is the chemical deterioration of the surface of a material, or the electrochemical deterioration of the surface of a material. Let's suppose we just take a little trip to England and look at the gargoyles that are on a lot of buildings that in this particular climate where they have been for years and years burning coal in the many, many grates all over the city, and they have a lot of fog, and we have then acid atmospheres. We have generated sulfuric acid in the air that's just floating around.